So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thanks for the great introduction, Marianne. So I'm Ram. I'm at the Building Technologies Office at the U.S. Department of Energy, and part of the work we do, essentially at BTO, our goal and mission is to help enable a zero carbon economy by 2050 with the decarbonized building sector. So what does that mean? We do a lot of work around, we fund a lot of work around research and development into building technologies. Some of the highlights of what we have been able to achieve with our funding is the LED lights that you see around every building, every office, every room, right? A lot of the underlying research for making LEDs cost competitive was funded through the Building Technologies Office. So that's one of the success stories. We work with systems integration, both residential and commercial. So, for example, one of the efforts we have is the Better Buildings, the Better Buildings effort, which is looking at how do we actually work with corporate partners, multifamily buildings, schools, to be able to help them to decarbonize. We have work on the residential side around enabling net zero communities. So many of the innovations that we have seen in the residential area with regards to energy efficient homes, windows, etc., came out through the work that was funded through the Building Technologies Office. And then finally, we also work on building codes. Our role is to do code determinations so that when you're working with ASHRAE 90.1 or IECC, we've been working with those agencies on advancing building codes, and as well as evaluating those codes for energy efficiency. And finally, we work on appliance standards, which means everything around air conditioning systems, heating systems, water heating systems, all the standards for energy efficiency around those are part of the portfolio of work that happens at the Building Technologies Office. So with that broad overview, not a brief overview, let me jump into what we have been looking at and how we have been thinking about the future and how do we achieve that future, right? So I'll start with the highest level, which is that what we want, we understand that buildings are where people live, buildings are where people learn, buildings are where we shop, buildings are where we spend 90% of our time. So whatever we work with in buildings, it has to take the people in those buildings into account, right? We have to make sure that these buildings are healthy, they have good air quality, that they're comfortable, and they're energy efficient and affordable. So when we look at a strategy for buildings, what we're looking at is a comprehensive strategy that incorporates not just the energy pieces of it, but making sure that these buildings are also places where we can spend 90% of our lives, right? So as we went through the strategy, we wanted to make sure it was people-centric, ensuring that there's high-quality jobs that come out of work we do in decarbonizing buildings, whether that's adding insulation to buildings, advancing control systems, replacing windows, replacing air conditioners and heat pumps. So there's high-quality jobs that are there through the work that can be done in improving our existing building stock, commercial, residential. And we want to make sure that we preserve our communities, but also more importantly, as we get into a world where we have more extreme conditions, making sure that our building stock is also resilient at the same time. We want to make sure that these buildings can help people tide through extreme weather events, that these buildings can keep them safe. So having that resiliency is also a key part of the focus of our office. So what's our vision for getting to net zero by 2050? So what we want to do is we want to be able to reduce our building emissions by 60% by 2035 and 90% by 2050. And that means that it is not a single-pronged strategy. It is about incorporating energy efficiency. We want to be able to reduce the energy footprint of our buildings by 50% by 2050. We want to accelerate reduction of on-site emissions, whether that's through combustion sources or even through things like refrigerants. We want to be able to transform the grid edge at buildings. So when we look at these buildings and we look at how new technologies, whether it's control, sensors, communications, how do these buildings get smarter but then how do these buildings also become a good citizen of the future grid? If you think about the fact that we have to, as we put in more heat pumps into buildings, as we add more electric vehicle charging into buildings, there's going to be a lot more demand for electricity out of these buildings. So making these buildings work more coherently with the grid is going to be key to making sure that we have a right-sized energy system. And finally, we want to reduce the building life cycle emissions. So in terms of embodied carbon, looking at the materials in construction, for example. And we want to do this while making sure we prioritize equity, affordability, and resilience. It's actually a primary goal to make sure that equity, affordability, and resilience are maintained while we are trying to achieve these larger goals. So as part of the strategy, we've been looking at different milestones. These are just some examples of activities that we can do. What can we do before 2030? What do we want to do between 2030 and 40? And then how do we actually achieve our objectives by 2050? So for example, when we work with multifamily housing or low and moderate income customers, right, where they might not have the electrical capacity to be able to put in heat pumps, we might be working on things like 120 volt appliances, small form factor technologies that can actually go into buildings to replace existing systems. How do we showcase through our federal activities on how we progress on building decarbonization? And then as we get more of these technologies put in place to address gaps in different market sectors, how do we use the timeframe from 2030 to 40 to adopt and scale these? So there's a lot of deployment activities, whether it's around showcasing how these things get implemented. Training our workforce is going to be a key part of this, because as we get some of these new technologies, being able to train the people who actually will be installing them and who will be commissioning them, not just installation, but also commissioning and getting the commissioning done right, and then being able to operate those buildings. Those are all key critical components of being able to manage the energy use of these buildings. And then over 2040 to 50, we want to complete the transition. We have technologies that we have developed. We have trained the workforce. Now we want to be able to scale it through the market. So I'll give you an example. So when we think about on-site emissions across the country, it's not very even. There are parts of the country where you have high percentage of electric heating, and then you have parts of the country where you have fuel-fired heating, a large percentage of fuel-fired heating. And so as we go through this transition, we have to also understand that there's a regionality for these different technologies. So understanding that and then understanding how we address that regional consideration. For example, if you're in a very cold climate, how do you get heat pumps that actually heat and work well at those cold climates? Trying to get those technologies in, but then also addressing the solutions is going to be key. So as we think about heat pumps, for example, what we want to do to get to this goal of 2050, by 2030, we want to get a significant adoption of heat pump water heaters in the market. We want to have heat pumps that can be applied in large commercial buildings. There's a technology gap there, so we want to look at how thermal systems can be applied for commercial buildings. And then over 2040, we want to start getting 50% penetration in commercial buildings, for example, so that by 2050, we are able to complete the transition. So this is an example of how we have to achieve different milestones to get to our 2050 goal. But achieving these milestones means that we have to have the workforce that's trained and ready to go for achieving these milestones. We are not going to be able to get 50% penetration in commercial buildings if we don't have the workforce. So all of that factors in being able to achieve those milestones. I'll give another example of some efforts that are going on at the Building Technologies Office. And this is the work we are doing with the Grid Edge and our effort around connected communities. So one of the things we realize and understand is that buildings are not going to sit in their own little silo going forward. Buildings are now becoming a point of integration for energy efficiency, for on-site renewables, battery storage, EVs. I'm sure there's a lot of people who are putting in chargers for EVs in buildings, as well as these more connectivity technologies that enable the customer, right? Whether it's smart thermostats, app-based management, dashboards, etc. And all of these have to work together so that we can actually make the grid work with the low carbon renewable grid. So as part of that effort, we have a series of about 10 projects around the country. These are pretty large projects. They're all demonstration projects looking at different aspects of how this future looks, where you have decarbonized buildings, smart buildings connected to a optimal grid. So I'll give some examples. We are doing some work around customer renewables and resilience. How do you look at things like community microgrids for customer resilience, right? And we have some work going on in Southern California, in Ohio, and Wisconsin around this concept of customer microgrids or community microgrids. We are working on zero emissions buildings. There's communities in Southern California that are building all electric homes, and then combining that with a community microgrid to see how we can actually balance those homes and those communities in conjunction with the grid. We are working in North Carolina with Duke Energy, for example, on these residential all-electric net zero demonstrations. We're looking at affordable housing. How do you retrofit them? How do you go in and adapt these existing buildings so that you can decarbonize them, but then also look at new technologies that can be applied, such as 120-volt heat pumps, so that you're not having to upgrade the panels and run extra wiring, etc., so that we can make these upgrades more cost effective. We're looking at energy rates, things like transactive pricing, and looking at how these building end users can actually support the grid by being able to react and manage in accordance with the pricing. Looking at vehicles, not just as where you plug in a charger, where you're running a cable, running 240, plugging in a charger, but how they can also be used to provide customer resilience. So part of this work is that in Southern California, we are working with Kia to look at to actually provide resilience. So if the power goes out, can your car actually power your home? And then finally looking at aggregation and integration of all these customer resources so that we can provide grid support. So these are just examples of efforts that we have ongoing and the type of research and the type of implementation that we are looking at as we go through this. Go through a couple of quickly touch on a couple of projects. This one is an open market ESCO is in Boston, looking at resiliency as a service. There's work going on in Seattle and with the New York City Housing Authority, looking at how do you decarbonize large multifamily buildings. This is an example of the type of work we are doing with vehicles, the integration of buildings and vehicles at this point, looking at multifamily residential charging infrastructure. How do you actually get, let's say you have multifamily communities where you have a lot of people working for Uber or Lyft, then how do you actually enable them to charge their cars at home, right, during the night? How do you work with commercial buildings and their control systems and their energy management systems so we can do workplace charging? Just a summary of these projects that are going around the country, but this is just an example of the type of work that we do at BTO. And so there's a whole number of these efforts that all add up together to be able to help us achieve our targets, achieve our goals for 2050 to decarbonize our building stock. So with that, let me pause and I'll invite Marianne back to her computer.
So how do you think when we think about this broad set of activities, we have energy efficiency, right, grid integration, we have things like electrification. How do you think about what resilience is? Is that about how to keep the how to keep services up when the electric grid's down, or do you think about extreme heat, or what do you think about resilience?
It's a great question, Marianne. So something that we are looking at, right? Resilience, I think, is about making sure that people can live inside their building.
Yeah.
It's making sure they have food.
Yeah.
Right. And it's making sure that they can survive through these events.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's a combination of multiple things.
Yeah.
We tend to think of resilience, like, a lot of times people tend to think of resilience.
Step a little closer.
So so that we are not ghosting.
Yeah.
So a lot of times people tend to think of resilience as something that's a grid measure.
Yeah.
Right. Or just putting solar in storage and trying to keep the power on. But it's more than that, right?
Yeah.
It's about having really good thermal envelopes so that even if you lose power, you're able to keep people comfortable in the buildings. It is about making sure that we have, so one of the concepts we're working on is distributed storage. Mm-hmm. So we've been working with a technology to do induction cooktops that work on 120 volts,
Right.
using storage embedded in the cooktop.
Yeah.
But the interesting part about it is that same storage, there's actually a plug where you can plug your refrigerator in.
Oh, wow.
So
I
now
didn't know
for
that.
3 days,
Yeah.
you can actually keep your food
Wow.
and cook for 3 days.
Right.
Right. So it's kind of looking at it from a comprehensive.
Yeah.
It's passive survivability.
Right.
How do you
Yeah.
actually survive
Yeah.
when extreme events happen?
Yeah.
When power goes out, right?
Mhm.
One way to do this is to put in more solar and storage, but the other way to do this is to actually have a better building itself.
Right.
So for us, it's a sum of all of the above.
Right.
Right.
In my last, in the talk I
Yeah.
gave earlier this morning,
Yeah.
somebody asked me about how do we do life cycle cost assessment for these kinds of things,
Yes.
which is so, we know how to do energy efficiency life
Right.
cycle costs, but all these other things are so much harder.
It is harder.
Yeah.
That is one of the areas that we want to look at.
Yeah.
Right. Both the metrics for resilience,
Yeah.
as well as the valuation of resilience.
Mhm.
Right. And it's not just resilience; it's also the same challenge we have around like indoor health and indoor air quality.
Mhm.
How do you actually get the valuation right so
Yeah.
that technologies that help us with those
Mhm.
can be validated, maybe become part of utility programs so
Mhm.
that they can get incentives and all that. So
Mhm.
that's an area I think we want to explore more.
Yeah.
And we're looking forward to doing that going
Yeah.
forward. So
Yeah, well, it's so interesting to think about health
yes.
because that's on the edge, but it seems like for DOE these days, that's a piece of the value
Right.
that it's harder to quantify, but it's part of your portfolio.
It is part of the portfolio. And I think
Yeah.
that's one of the changes, right? It's not just about energy anymore.
Yeah.
It is about looking at it from a holistic perspective.
Yeah.
Livability, survivability, health, all of those factor in
Yeah.
because that's what our buildings are about.
Yeah.
People get into buildings so that they can get things done.
Yeah.
Right. So that they can live.
Yeah.
So yeah. So that's a good point. I
And
mean, it's an emerging area
Right.
of research for us.
And
Yeah.
how do you see health in building codes? Do you see I mean, normally in the past, we set ventilation standards.
Right.
Based on, air quality.
Yes.
And there are now ventilation standards, they're in residential, which
Yes.
is very new in some ways.
Yes. And so that's one way we have done it.
Yeah.
Right. So you have like Title 24 and has 62.1,
Right.
which is
Require
requiring
ASHRAE,
ash
right.
rate. And then in commercial, we've been regulating ventilation, but it's based on CO2.
Yeah.
But that's just one part of the
Pollutant,
one of the pollutants, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll have to look at how we get more of these incorporated, whether
Yeah.
it's PM 2.5, whether it's NOx. How do you incorporate that into building codes and then through the standards? So I think that's another emerging area we have to look at.
Yeah.
But I think there is a role for it,
Mhm.
right? And I think as we get to these more futuristic homes and buildings, we
Yeah.
have to get there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And how do you think about integrating the EV as a buildings person?
Yes.
The EV is sort of it's a transportation load.
Yeah.
And it's on our electric meter now for those of us that charge at home.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of tell us about how you work with the vehicle technology office, or is that an emerging?
No. It's a great question because it's something that we have been actively trying to do.
Yeah.
EVs are a load, right? So if you think of EVs, there's like 4 or 5 different places where they get charged, right? One is homes.
Yeah.
The other is office buildings.
Mhm.
The third is like fleet depots and
Public
stations.
Yeah.
Then you have supercharging for EVs. Then you have things like warehouses where you're going to be doing truck charging, etc. Right? And I think each of them are slightly different because when you're looking at home charging, the 2 challenges that seem to keep coming up is having enough service to charge your EVs and then being able to manage the cost of charging the EVs, which is through the rates, right? So when you are applying time of use tariffs, they apply to EVs too. So we have to look at buildings. When we look at residential and even office charging, I think they're so integrated with buildings, right, that we cannot really see them separately. We have to look at it together.
Yeah.
So that's why we're doing more things like what we call the easy price, which is like how do you balance EV charging with constrained electrical capacity in conjunction with your heat pumps, right? So we're doing that for residential. In commercial, we have to look at how we can use our energy management systems
Mhm.
to manage your workforce charging,
Uh-huh.
right? Or workplace charging,
Yeah.
so that you can manage your peak loads, because
Yeah.
most commercial buildings pay based on peak.
Right.
So that's, again, some of the things. So some of the connected communities projects
Yep.
are starting to look at it, but it's definitely something that we have to work with. And we are definitely starting to work a lot more closely with the vehicles office
Yeah.
on this aspect.
Yeah. No,
So,
that's great. Let me
yeah.
let me see if there's any more
Yes.
questions here. I don't think there. Oh, yeah, there's one. Oh, there's a couple.
Okay.
Okay. Did you think that the building market will create a more accessible carbon credit market? Do you think the building market will create a more accessible carbon credit market?
Um, um, so I am going to try to interpret that question and maybe answer two ways. So one way you can create a carbon benefit is, let's say you're doing energy efficiency,
Mhm.
can that be converted into carbon credits,
Mhm.
right? And I think there are some efforts going on,
Mhm.
early efforts going on in, like, I think the Northeast
Yep.
or Connecticut, to try to do that.
Yeah.
Still emerging. If you're looking at using low carbon materials,
Yeah.
I think that is something that might already be happening, because people are looking at how do you take, for example, when you're using direct air capture,
Yeah.
can you sink it into building materials and sequester it forever?
Right.
And there's a huge value for that today,
Right.
right? Especially with things like direct air capture. So, so I think it's an emerging thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to emerge in two different ways.
Yeah.
So we'll see where it goes. But I would love to see the energy efficiency part
Right.
get greater recognition in the
Right.
carbon markets.
And I think in both those cases, how we develop the measurement framework
Right.
to actually give credit to the investors is going to be kind of
It's
an
go- yeah.
interesting, a lot of action there.
And it's like the quality, right? Right now, there's a lot of discussion around the quality of the carbon credits. And if you do it at the buildings, I think it's actually higher quality credits for
Right.
the carbon market.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very good. They're popping up here.
Yes.
Any ideas on how to get into the marketplace, all these benefits to the people, so people are comfortable with and actually strive to decarbonize? So getting the benefits so that people,
So I think part of it is going to be doing the work so we can quantify the benefits,
Mhm.
so we can clearly show that the benefits are there,
Mhm.
and being able to publish that, being able to talk about it, right? I think so. We have to continue doing the work around data validation
Mhm.
of the benefits,
Mhm.
right? I think that's probably the way we'll get there, so that people can become comfortable, right?
Great. So we got two more and we're almost at
Yeah.
time. We'll go through these quickly. The EV market in the US is experiencing a bit of a slowdown, at least for now. Will charging infrastructure continue to grow despite the slowdown?
Um, I think so. I think there's a lot of funding available through the Infrastructure Reduction Act
Mm-hmm.
for charging infrastructure.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to keep spurring
Yeah.
the development of the charging infrastructure. I think what's been happening is that the infrastructure has actually lagged
Yeah.
EV sales.
Yeah.
So it's actually been a barrier
Yeah.
for adoption outside of probably Tesla.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what we are going to see is that as the infrastructure builds and more people go to malls and see chargers, they are going to feel more comfortable with actually buying more EVs.
I think so too.
So,
I
yeah.
think they're going to catch up. Have organizations, this is the last one, have
Yeah.
organizations considered working with and encouraging the people who are most responsible for building performance? This would likely be architects. Have organizations considered working with, oh, there's more there.
Yeah.
This would, architects, engineers, contractors, and of course, owners. Could an early step be asking owners and architects and engineers to track the actual energy use intensity of the building they're responsible for? Years that is, and modeled energy use would be useful. Access to the data
Yeah.
could be built into the contract or between owners and designers.
I think, Scott, that's a great point, right? It's something that we are definitely interested in because, most of the buildings get built based on modeling,
Mm-hmm.
and we are looking at how we can actually correlate that modeling to actual energy performance.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to extend it out
Mhm.
so that, and so as you look at newer things like building performance standards that are coming up, they are based on actual performance. So how do you actually connect the codes with the building performance standards so that we can have a continuum of from the model to commissioning to actual energy performance, and how do we actually build all that together? So
Well-
it's a great point. I mean, something we are definitely interested in looking into.
And that's a great one to end on, because I
Yes.
think we're a minute over, but
Yep.
thank you so much for everybody for joining, and thanks, Ram, for your comments. It's
Yep.
really interesting discussion, and appreciate your presentation.
Thank you, Marianne. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.